Hey, welcome to Minute 60. Tonight we're diving into two true scary stories. Real events that happen to ordinary people right inside their homes, neighborhoods, and places you might have thought were safe. These aren't just stories. They're the kind that make you double-check your locks, glance at the shadows, and wonder if something unseen is watching. Before we begin, I want to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked in your bed somewhere in the US or sneaking your headphones on somewhere else? Drop a comment and say hi. I love seeing who's brave enough to listen all the way through. Keep your lights low, headphones on, and imagination ready. Because what you're about to hear might just stay with you long after the video ends. First, we'll experience Story 1, where a peaceful summer night takes a terrifying turn. Then we'll move into Story 2, a slow, deliberate journey through shadows, footsteps, and the unnerving presence of the unknown. Are you ready? Let's begin. The sun hung low just above the tree line, spilling molten gold and deep violet across the sky. The gravel road stretched ahead, twisting and disappearing into shadows that seemed to reach out like dark fingers. Crickets chirped in the fading warmth, and the low hum of cicadas added a strange rhythm to the evening. The air smelled of pine and earth, slightly damp from a late summer breeze, with a faint hint of smoke drifting from somewhere far off. Mark guided the car carefully along the winding road, tires crunching softly over gravel. Every turn revealed more of the lake, its surface like polished black glass, reflecting the streaks of the dying sunlight. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine, not from the air, but from a feeling she couldn't name. The tree line on either side of the road seemed thicker, darker, almost alive. Shadows swayed as though they had a consciousness of their own. The lake itself was mesmerizing, calm and still, with occasional tiny ripples as fish skimmed the surface. Everything about it seemed perfect. Almost too perfect. A sense of waiting hung over the water, a silence that felt intentional. Jenna tightened her sweatshirt around her shoulders, glancing nervously at the darkened tree line. Something out there. Someone might be watching, she thought, though she tried to dismiss it. Still, a tiny knot of unease had formed in her stomach, a whisper telling her to be cautious, even before they'd unpacked a single chair. Mark eased the car off the gravel road and into a small clearing beside the lake. The tires crunched softly on loose stones as he came to a stop. The lake stretched out before them, still and dark, reflecting the streaks of twilight like a black mirror. The air was thick with the scent of wet grass and the faint, lingering warmth of the day. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves in a soft, almost whispering cadence. Jenna stepped out first, her feet crunching on the gravel. She pulled her sweatshirt tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly despite the warmth that still lingered from the sun. Something about the tree line on the far side of the lake made her pause, long, dark shadows that seemed heavier than they should be, stretching toward them like silent watchers. She shook her head, telling herself it was just a trick of the fading light. Luis got out next, balancing the firewood awkwardly on his shoulder. He glanced around the edge of the tree line as he walked, his footsteps careful, deliberate. Every sound, his shoes against gravel, the snap of a twig, seemed louder in the stillness, echoing across the water. Mark climbed out last, closing the car door gently, and took a slow, deep breath, trying to shake the creeping tension in the air. The three of them stood together for a moment, taking in the lake. Fish occasionally broke the surface, ripples spreading outward, and the smell of pine, damp earth, and water filled their senses. The calm was hypnotic, almost too serene. Jenna's stomach fluttered with a mix of anticipation and unease, a subtle warning she didn't fully understand. Something in the shadows felt wrong, but she couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination running wild in the dying light of a summer evening. They began unloading their gear from the car. Folding chairs thumped softly against the gravel as Mark set them up near the water's edge. Louise carefully carried the firewood bundle, stepping over scattered rocks and roots while trying not to drop a single log. The cooler, stuffed with drinks and snacks, clinked and rattled with every movement, every sound, metal against metal, wood against gravel. The faint rustle of leaves in the breeze felt amplified in the evening stillness, echoing across the water and the dark tree line. Jenna lingered a moment, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, letting the cool air wash over her. She watched the rippling surface of the lake, fascinated by the way the water mirrored the last streaks of sunlight and the creeping darkness of the woods beyond. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed timeless. The perfect end to summer. The laughter, the warmth, the friends, the calm water. It all felt like it could stretch on forever. But beneath that fleeting peace, Jenna felt something shift. A prickling along the back of her neck, a subtle tightening in her stomach. She scanned the tree line across the lake, blinking and shaking her head. Was it just the shadows playing tricks? Or was there someone or something out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, watching them prepare for a night that was supposed to be simple and fun? She forced herself to laugh softly at the thought, though the tension lingered like a shadow at the edge of her awareness. Louise dropped the last piece of firewood near where the fire would go, glancing around nervously. Mark busied himself arranging the chairs, humming softly to keep the mood light. But even their casual chatter seemed muted under the weight of the evening. The lake was calm, yes, but too calm. Every small sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made their hearts jump, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Finally, the three of them settled into their chairs, sitting close enough to feel the warmth of the fire they were about to light. The lake stretched endlessly before them, a dark, glassy expanse reflecting the fiery hues of the sky fading into deep purple. Tiny ripples broke the surface as fish jumped, glinting silver in the last light, but the calm was otherwise unbroken. Every sound an insect buzzing near the water, the soft lap of the shoreline, the distant call of a bird settling for the night, seemed magnified, echoing into the tree line. Mark tossed a small pebble into the lake, watching it skip twice before sinking. The water shimmered, briefly disturbed, then returned to its mirror-like stillness. Louise leaned back, taking in the scene with a deep breath, letting the peacefulness wash over him. Jenna smiled faintly, the corners of her lips tugging up as she took a sip from her water bottle. But even as they enjoyed the calm, there was a subtle tension beneath it. The tree line across the lake seemed darker than usual, almost alive. Shadows stretched and shifted, hints of movement at the edge of her vision. Jenna tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps a fish jumping or a deer moving unseen, but a small knot of unease twisted in her stomach. Something was watching. Something was waiting. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine, mixed with the warmth from the sun lingering on the water. Every tiny sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of a frog, the soft breeze over the water made the stillness feel heavier, like the lake itself was holding its breath. The three friends laughed softly, joking about nothing in particular, trying to shake off the growing tension. Yet deep down, each of them felt it, that feeling that this night was different, that this calm might not last. Jenna's gaze lingered on the lake, watching the ripples fade across the darkening water. Her mind wandered, imagining how they would remember this night years from now, the warmth of the fire, the scent of pine and earth, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. A perfect memory of summer, she thought, a night to hold on to forever. But then her peripheral vision caught something, a faint movement along the far edge of the tree line. She blinked, shaking her head, trying to convince herself it was only the shadows stretching as the sun disappeared. Her stomach tightened, a cold knot forming, and she felt a shiver run from her neck down to her fingers. Something wasn't right. Someone, or something, was out there, just beyond her line of sight, observing. Luis noticed her sudden pause. "What is it?" he asked, tilting his head toward the darkness. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Mark followed their gaze toward the trees, his brow furrowing, but all he could see was shadow, deep, endless, moving in ways that didn't feel natural. The three of them sat there, a strange hush settling over the clearing. The wind stirred the pine needles, sending soft rustles into the night, yet it seemed as if the air itself had grown heavier. Every tiny sound, the croak of a frog, the distant splash of a fish, even the gentle crackle of leaves, felt amplified, echoing from the darkness. Jenna's heart beat faster. She wanted to laugh it off, to tell herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But the feeling refused to leave. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And for the first time that evening they all felt it, not just in the pit of their stomachs, but in the silent tension of the night itself, in the way the shadows seemed to lean closer, almost alive. The perfect evening had begun to twist into something different, something uncertain. Mark struck a match, the tiny flame flickering before catching the kindling. The fire sputtered to life, sending up a few sparks that floated lazily into the twilight sky. The warmth spread outward in a soft, comforting glow, contrasting sharply with the cool, shadowed air around them. The crackling of the wood was almost hypnotic, each pop echoing slightly across the still lake, blending with the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. As the fire grew, the smell of burning pine and dry wood mixed with the earthy scent of the lake. Jenna inhaled deeply, letting the warmth of the fire reach her fingers and face. The soft orange light painted their faces, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground and the trunks of the trees nearby. Even the small movements, the way a flickering flame stretched a shadow, the gentle sway of the chairs, added layers of movement to the otherwise still night. Luis poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of tiny sparks upward. "This is perfect," he said, almost to himself, his voice carrying softly over the lake. Mark laughed lightly, tossing a log onto the growing flame. The fire hissed and popped, the sound sharp in the quiet air, as if drawing attention to itself. But even as the fire crackled, there was a subtle tension beneath the warmth. Shadows along the edge of the clearing seemed to stretch further than the light should allow, twisting unnaturally in the glow. Jenna felt her stomach tighten again, a familiar prickle running up her spine. The tree line across the lake looked darker now, almost alive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the firelight, watching. The friends laughed softly, voices gentle, trying to ease the creeping unease. Yet beneath the humor and warmth, the night had already begun to feel different. The perfect summer evening was slowly shifting, the stillness of the lake and forest stretching, waiting for the moment when they would realize they were not alone. They roasted marshmallows over the fire, golden brown and slightly crisp on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside. Sticky sweetness clung to their fingers, and every bite sent a warm rush of comfort through them. Laughter bubbled up naturally, light and carefree, echoing softly across the still lake. They teased each other about who could roast a marshmallow without burning it. Luis claimed he was a master, Mark protested that skill didn't matter, and Jenna laughed at both of them, the sound bright against the growing darkness. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting expressions and flickering across their eyes. Shadows from the flames stretched along the ground and up the trunks of the nearby trees, twisting and moving in ways that made the forest seem almost alive. Jenna watched the reflections in the lake, tiny ripples distorting the firelight as if the water itself were participating in their evening. For a brief moment, the night felt timeless. The fire, the laughter, the warm air, everything was perfect. They were suspended in a bubble of comfort, a memory in the making of summer that they thought could last forever. Each crackle of the fire, each rustle in the leaves, seemed ordinary. Until it wasn't. Jenna's eyes flicked to the far tree line and she saw it, a faint, flickering light moving slowly between the shadows. At first, she thought it was just another camper, or perhaps a reflection from something on the water. But the movement was deliberate, controlled. It wasn't random. Her stomach tightened, a low hum of fear threading through the laughter, a whisper in the back of her mind. They're watching. Luis noticed her pause. "What is it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Jenna shook her head, forcing a laugh, but even in the glow of the fire, the tension was palpable. Mark, sensing her unease, glanced toward the trees across the lake, his smile fading slightly. The night was still beautiful, still warm, but suddenly the air felt heavier, filled with the possibility of something waiting just beyond the firelight. As they laughed and roasted marshmallows, the shadows from the fire began to shift and stretch in ways that felt almost unnatural. The trunks of the trees lining the clearing seemed taller, darker, and more imposing than before, their long shadows stretching toward the lake as if leaning into the firelight. Every flicker of flame distorted the shapes around them, creating illusions of movement at the edge of their vision. Jenna's eyes were drawn to the far side of the lake. There it was again, a faint, flickering light moving between the trees. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or a casual camper's glow. No, it moved too deliberately, stopping and starting as if whoever, or whatever, was carrying it knew they were being watched. Her stomach clenched, cold and tight, and a shiver ran up her spine. Luis noticed her gaze and followed it. "Are you seeing that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less playful. The laughter had died down naturally, leaving only the soft pop and crackle of the fire. Mark squinted across the water, frowning. "Probably someone fishing," he said, trying to sound convincing, though his tone lacked certainty. The three of them sat in uneasy silence, the warmth of the fire contrasting sharply with the prickling unease creeping along their nerves. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, even the gentle lapping of water against the shore, seemed louder now, more deliberate, as if the night itself were listening and waiting. Jenna forced herself to smile, turning her attention back to the fire. But her mind kept drifting to that flickering light. It moved again, closer this time, and a subtle fear took hold. Something about it felt wrong, not just out of place, but purposeful. And in that instant they all felt it. The night had shifted. The perfect summer evening was no longer entirely theirs. Something, or someone, was out there, watching. The evening air grew cooler, brushing against their skin like a soft whisper. The fire crackled in front of them, sending tiny sparks into the sky that vanished into the deepening purple shadows above. Jenna's gaze kept flicking to the far tree line across the lake, where the faint light had appeared again. This time it seemed closer, and she could almost swear it paused, lingering for a heartbeat before moving again. Mark noticed her stare. "You're seeing that too, right?" he asked, though his voice was low, uncertain. Luis shifted uneasily in his chair, pretending to poke at the fire, but clearly tense. For the first time, the light wasn't just an odd flicker. It felt deliberate, almost like it had a purpose. A cold tension began to weave through the warmth of the fire, an invisible thread tightening around their chests. The shadows at the edges of the clearing seemed to creep closer, stretching unnaturally as if trying to reach them. Each movement in the trees, the sway of branches, the shuffle of leaves, the distant rustle of wildlife, felt amplified, almost staged, each one sending a tiny jolt of fear up their spines. Jenna's stomach twisted, a low, insistent warning gnawing at her thoughts. This isn't normal, she told herself, but the logical part of her brain fought the feeling, insisting it was just imagination. A small frog leapt into the lake, a splash echoing across the still water, but even that seemed eerie in the tense silence that had settled over the clearing. The friends laughed softly, more as a nervous gesture than genuine amusement, trying to maintain normalcy. But each laugh faded quickly, leaving the oppressive quiet to reclaim the night. And then, for a fleeting moment, everything froze. The wind stopped, the water stilled, even the fire seemed to dim, as if the lake and forest themselves were holding their breath. The light in the tree line flickered again. Watching. Waiting. The night air had grown noticeably cooler, brushing against their skin and carrying with it the sharp, earthy scent of the lake and forest. The fire flickered gently, casting elongated, dancing shadows on the ground and across the tree trunks, shadows that seemed to twist and stretch in ways that didn't match the flames. Every small movement, the rustle of a leaf, the distant splash of water, the chirp of a late-night insect, sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence that had settled over them. Jenna could no longer take her eyes off the faint, flickering light across the lake. It wasn't steady, but deliberate, moving slowly between the trees. It stopped once, twice, as if whoever, or whatever, was carrying it was watching them as intently as they were watching it. Her stomach twisted with unease, a cold, sinking knot that made her fingers tingle. Luis shifted in his chair, glancing nervously at the dark tree line, then back at Jenna. "Maybe it's just someone messing around," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Mark poked the fire with a stick, sending a tiny cascade of sparks into the night, but even the warmth of the fire didn't chase away the growing sense of dread. The three friends sat in tense silence, laughter gone, their attention entirely absorbed by the distant light. Every instinct screamed at them that something was wrong, that they were being watched. The wind stirred briefly, shaking branches and leaves, making the shadows dance across the clearing. A ripple passed over the lake, reflecting the fire and the flickering light in eerie patterns, as if the water itself were alive, participating in the silent game unfolding around them. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything felt suspended in time. The lake, the forest, the fire, the shadows, they all seemed to be waiting. Waiting for them to realize that the night they thought was peaceful, perfect, and carefree had already shifted into something far more dangerous, something unseen, deliberate, and very close. The fire had burned lower now, glowing embers casting a soft, reddish light across the clearing. The warmth it had provided was fading, and a subtle chill began creeping into the air, brushing against their skin and making the hairs on Jenna's arms stand on end. Across the lake, the faint, flickering light appeared again, closer than before, moving deliberately between the trees. It wasn't the playful, random flicker of a camper's flashlight. It paused at moments, as if assessing them, measuring them. Mark leaned forward slightly, squinting into the darkened tree line. "It's probably nothing, just someone walking by," he said, but his voice carried a nervous edge he couldn't hide. Luis nodded slowly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Yeah, probably," he muttered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Jenna's stomach churned, her heart beat faster, each pulse echoing in her ears. The unease she had felt since arriving had grown heavier, pressing down on her chest. The shadows around the clearing seemed to thicken, stretching unnaturally as if the trees themselves were leaning inward, curious or perhaps predatory. Every slight noise, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of a fish, the soft whisper of wind, sounded amplified, deliberate. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before, and the night felt suddenly claustrophobic. Jenna whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "It's watching us." The words barely left her lips, yet they hung in the air like a warning. Mark and Louise exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement that the feeling they had all been trying to ignore was real. They had entered the lake that evening expecting laughter and relaxation, but now every instinct screamed at them that something was wrong. And then, somewhere in the shadows behind them, a branch snapped, sharp, heavy, deliberate. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife, freezing them in place. It was close, too close. They hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen movement, but the unmistakable snap confirmed their worst fears. They were not alone. Mark swallowed hard, forcing a laugh that came out hollow. "Probably just a deer, or some kids messing around," he said, though his eyes never left the dark tree line. The words were meant to calm, to rationalize, but even he didn't believe them. Every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. The forest around them had shifted subtly, the air heavier, the shadows darker, the usual night sounds strangely muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Luis shifted in his chair, scanning the edges of the clearing nervously. The flickering light across the lake had stopped moving for a moment, as if it had noticed their attention, and paused deliberately. The embers of the fire popped softly, but even that small, comforting sound seemed foreign now, almost out of place. A shiver ran down his spine, and he rubbed his arms, trying to shake the creeping cold that wasn't from the air. It was from the fear, from knowing they were being watched. Jenna's mind raced. She remembered all the little warnings she'd ignored earlier, the prickling at the back of her neck, the heaviness in the air, the way the shadows seemed to lean closer. Now, every small sound was magnified, every movement in the tree line suspicious. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her temples, as if her body was anticipating something terrible. Then a faint rustle from the edge of the clearing made them all jump. Not a casual sound, this was deliberate, measured. Something had shifted position, and though they couldn't see it, they knew instinctively that it was close. Too close, Mark whispered, almost inaudibly. "We need to stay calm, just calm." But even as he said it, his hands trembled slightly. Luis nodded, though his jaw was tight, and Jenna's eyes never left the tree line across the lake. The night that had begun with laughter and warmth had dissolved into tension and fear. They were no longer sitting by a peaceful fire, they were sitting in a trap, and something in the darkness knew it. The shadows along the edge of the clearing seemed to thicken, stretching unnaturally as though they had a life of their own. The tree line across the lake appeared darker now, every gap between trees like a small mouth waiting to swallow them. Jenna's pulse raced, her fingers tightening around the armrests of her chair. Every sound, the whisper of the wind, the faint ripple of water, the distant call of a night bird, felt amplified, deliberate, like signals from the forest itself. The flickering light moved again, closer this time, weaving between the trees in a way that was almost purposeful. It paused once, and Jenna thought she saw a shadow, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. Her stomach knotted, a cold dread curling upward from her gut. She swallowed hard, trying to force calm, but the fear was too heavy, too real. Luis shifted again, his eyes darting nervously between the fire and the distant tree line. He poked at the embers with a stick, sending tiny sparks upward, as if the movement would break the tension. But the sparks felt meaningless against the growing pressure of the night. Mark's shoulders were tense, jaw tight, as he kept glancing toward the lake, pretending to scan for campers or animals, but silently acknowledging that whatever was out there wasn't ordinary. The wind rustled a branch behind them. It wasn't casual. It snapped sharply, close enough to startle all three, their breaths caught in unison. For a long moment they froze, every muscle rigid, every sense straining. The lake remained eerily still, reflecting the dim glow of the fire and the distant flickering light. Jenna's voice was barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." Her words trembled, not because she didn't want to stay, but because she knew they were being watched, and the forest, the night, and the lake themselves seemed complicit. The laughter, the warmth, the carefree summer evening, it was gone, replaced by the cold, creeping realization that they were no longer alone. The air had grown colder now, a creeping chill that brushed against their necks and arms, carrying with it the sharp scent of damp earth and pine. The fire's warmth was fading, its glow barely pushing back the deepening shadows around the clearing. The faint flickering light across the lake remained, moving slowly and deliberately between the trees, pausing at intervals as though observing them. Jenna's eyes followed it, her chest tightening with every flicker. The forest seemed to press in closer, each tree trunk now a looming, silent figure. The wind whispered through the branches, sending leaves fluttering down like tiny shadows, each movement amplified in the tense stillness. Luis swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edges of his chair, every muscle taut. Mark's attempts at casual conversation had died out completely. The only sounds were the subtle crackle of the fire and the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore. Then came another snap. Closer this time, not from the lake, not from the wind, but behind them. A branch, heavy and deliberate, broke in the shadows. They all jumped, hearts hammering, and for a moment no one breathed. Every instinct screamed to look, to run, but their eyes remained glued to the lake, where the flickering light had moved slightly closer. Jenna whispered, almost to herself, "It knows we're watching it." Her voice trembled, but even she felt the truth in the words. The calm, carefree night they had arrived expecting had shifted into something darker, something deliberate. Each crackle of the fire, each rustle of leaves, each tiny splash from the lake seemed orchestrated now, part of a silent game being played just beyond the tree line. The three friends sat frozen, a tense silence stretching between them. Every instinct, every sense, screamed that the night had changed, that whatever was out there wasn't ordinary. And in that moment, the perfect summer evening they had imagined was gone, replaced with an unseen presence that was patient, deliberate, and very, very close. The fire had burned low now, its orange glow flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine, mixed with the subtle, metallic tang of tension. The flickering light across the lake had moved again, closer, weaving between the trees in a way that made Jenna's stomach twist. She could feel the weight of its presence, deliberate, watching, patient. Luis whispered, almost inaudibly, "We need to pack up. Now." Mark nodded slowly, his face pale in the weak firelight. Even the warmth of the fire could not ease the cold knot of fear coiling in their chests. Every instinct screamed that something was very wrong. Every rustle of leaves, every subtle movement in the shadows seemed like a warning. Jenna's eyes darted toward the tree line, and she thought she saw a figure, a dark silhouette blending perfectly with the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her ears. The lake, which had seemed calm and inviting only hours ago, now mirrored the darkness of the forest, reflecting the flickering light in eerie, distorted patterns. The friends stood together, chairs abandoned, their hands trembling slightly as they moved closer to the car. The night that had begun with laughter and warmth had transformed completely. The air was electric with tension, the forest and lake alive with unseen eyes. Even as they moved, the flickering light seemed to follow them, deliberately pausing, observing their every action. And for the first time that evening, they realized they were not just being watched, they were being hunted, or at least assessed, by something patient and unseen. The perfect summer night had vanished, leaving in its place a lingering dread, a silent understanding that they were no longer alone. By now, the warmth from the fire had almost disappeared, leaving only smouldering embers that cast weak, flickering shadows across the clearing. The once comforting crackle now sounded sharp, almost threatening in the silence of the night. Jenna's stomach churned as she scanned the tree line across the lake. The flickering light had moved yet again, closer, and it seemed to pulse with a deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat syncing with her own. Luis's hands were trembling as he gathered the remaining firewood. Every movement he made seemed loud, amplified by the tense stillness surrounding them. Mark grabbed a flashlight from the car, its weak beam cutting a narrow path through the shadows, but it barely reached the dark edge of the trees. "We need to leave," he whispered, the words more urgent than before. His voice shook, betraying the fear he tried to hide. Jenna's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet her legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. The air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing down on them. Even the soft sounds of nature, the chirping of insects, the distant croak of a frog, sounded distorted, almost deliberate, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then a sudden rustle came from behind them. A snapping branch, sharp and deliberate, made them all jump. The hair on Jenna's arms stood on end, and her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The flickering light across the lake paused again, almost as if it had noticed their reaction. Fear tightened its grip, and the laughter, warmth, and carefree energy of earlier hours was gone, replaced entirely by a cold, creeping dread. Luis whispered urgently, "Come on, let's just go, now." Mark shined the flashlight toward the tree line, but it revealed nothing, just the endless darkness and the faintly shifting shadows. Jenna swallowed hard, feeling her throat tighten. They were no longer safe. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching. They were closing in, waiting for the moment when the panic would take over completely. They moved quickly now, abandoning the chairs and scattered firewood, gathering only the essentials. Every step on the gravel and dirt sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The air was cold against their skin, carrying the damp scent of the lake and the forest. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but it came in short, sharp bursts, betraying the fear gripping her body. The flickering light across the lake had stopped moving, but it now seemed even closer, hovering just at the edge of the tree line. Jenna could feel its presence, patient and deliberate, watching their every move. Her stomach twisted, a tight knot of dread forming as her mind raced through every horror story she'd ever heard, the ones that were just stories, until they weren't. Luis was ahead, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand as he scanned the dark path toward the car. Every shadow seemed to twitch unnaturally. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch felt deliberate, as if someone, or something, was orchestrating the night around them. Mark followed close behind, holding another flashlight, its narrow beam barely penetrating the thick darkness. Jenna's hands shook as she clutched her sweatshirt tighter around herself. Her eyes darted back to the tree line across the lake, where the flickering light had started moving again, slowly, methodically. It wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, and it was following them. A sudden crack of a branch just a few feet behind them made them all jump. Their breath caught, a collective gasp, breaking the tense silence. For the first time that evening, the laughter and warmth of the lake were gone entirely. All that remained was fear, pure, raw, and immediate. Panic was no longer creeping in. It had arrived, taking hold of their minds, their senses, and their instincts, warning them that leaving calmly was no longer an option. Their footsteps crunched loudly over gravel and fallen leaves, echoing unnaturally in the still night. Every movement felt urgent, yet hesitant, as if the darkness itself was resisting them. Jenna's heart pounded so violently she could hear it in her ears. The flickering light across the lake had shifted again, closer now, and for a brief instant she thought she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A dark silhouette, tall and impossibly still, blending perfectly with the trees. Mark glanced back, flashlight shaking slightly. "We're not alone," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rush of adrenaline in their ears. Louise swallowed hard, scanning the edge of the tree line for movement, but all he could see were shadows, dark, twisting, and alive in their peripheral vision. The cold night air bit at their skin, carrying the smell of wet earth, pine, and something faintly metallic, a scent that made their stomachs twist in fear. Every rustle of leaves, every subtle splash from the lake, every snap of a branch seemed amplified, deliberate, like the forest itself was aware of their panic. Jenna's mind raced, trying to think rationally, to convince herself it was just shadows and imagination, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, pressed relentlessly against her. The light moved again, deliberately, following the tree line, its subtle rhythm like a pulse syncing with their fear. Luis muttered, "We need to get to the car, now!" His voice tense, urgent. Mark nodded, quickening their pace, but even as they hurried, Jenna could feel the presence behind them, patient, silent, deliberate. Panic had fully taken over, sharp and suffocating. The night had changed completely. What had started as a carefree summer evening by the lake had become a test of survival, a night where every shadow could hide danger, and every movement might be their last calm step before chaos. The tree line seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching unnaturally toward the clearing. The flickering light across the lake was now unmistakably closer, moving with deliberate intent, weaving between the trees as if mapping their path. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of wet earth, pine, and something indefinably wrong, metallic, heavy, like warning. Jenna's chest tightened as she glanced at her friends. Luis's hands trembled as he gripped the flashlight, knuckles white. Mark's jaw was rigid, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. None of them spoke, words impossible to form in the thick tension. All that existed was the urgent need to reach the car and the oppressive presence behind them, patient, deliberate, and unseen. A sudden rustle to their right made them all freeze. A branch cracked sharply underfoot, echoing through the clearing. Jenna's stomach dropped. Adrenaline surged through her veins as her mind screamed, "Run! Now!" Yet the path was dark, uneven, every step a potential hazard. The flickering light paused for a moment, almost as if it were considering them, waiting for a misstep. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, offered no comfort. Its weak light barely touched the edges of the clearing, leaving the shadows around them thick and impenetrable. Every snap, rustle, and whisper of the night seemed amplified, deliberate, orchestrated to keep them on edge. Jenna's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of panic pressing down, her heart thudding violently. Mark whispered. "Almost there, just a little further." But even as they moved, the oppressive sense of being observed never left. The night had fully transformed. What had started as laughter and warmth had become a tense, relentless hunt, with shadows as participants and an unseen force pulling the strings. They reached the car at last, breathless and tense. The cold metal of the door pressed against Jenna's palms as she fumbled for the handle, her fingers shaking violently. Louise and Mark were beside her, equally frantic, every muscle taut, eyes darting toward the dark tree line across the lake where the flickering light had paused again. It watched them still, patient, deliberate, and impossibly close. The forest around them was alive with sound, yet eerily silent at the same time. Every rustle, every subtle shift of the shadows seemed amplified, like the night itself was aware of their fear. The lake, once calm and inviting, now mirrored the darkness of the trees, reflecting the faint flicker of that deliberate light in eerie, distorted patterns. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she slammed the door and fumbled with the keys. Mark and Louise climbed in, their faces pale in the weak glow of the dashboard. The fire, now just smouldering embers, cast faint light behind them, but offered no comfort. Every instinct screamed at them that the presence behind the tree line was not leaving. Not yet. As Mark started the engine, the car lights illuminated the clearing, cutting through some of the shadows. The flickering light across the lake vanished abruptly, leaving nothing but darkness in its place. A tense silence hung for a heartbeat. Then a rustle from the forest edge behind them reminded them the night was still alive, still watching. Jenna exhaled shakily, trying to calm her racing heart. They had made it to the car, yes, but the unease lingered, a persistent, gnawing presence. The perfect summer night had ended, leaving in its place a memory that would haunt them, a night where laughter and warmth had dissolved into fear, tension, and the knowledge that sometimes the darkness is more than just shadows. The engine hummed to life, a small comfort against the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. Jenna gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the car lights cut through the shadows of the clearing. Every movement outside, the swaying of branches, the ripples across the lake, felt amplified, deliberate, like the forest itself was watching their escape. Louise leaned forward, straining to see past the tree line, while Mark kept glancing in the rearview mirror, every shadow a potential threat. The air inside the car was thick with tension, their breaths coming in short, uneven bursts. The night that had started with laughter and warmth now pressed heavily upon them, its presence palpable in every sound and movement outside. The faint glow of the fire behind them dwindled, casting the clearing into near darkness, leaving only the soft shimmer of embers and the distant reflection across the lake. The flickering light that had haunted them all evening had vanished, but Jenna's instinct screamed that it hadn't gone. It was simply waiting, patient, calculating. Every turn of the tires on the gravel felt dangerously loud, as if announcing their departure to whatever watched from the shadows. The air smelled of damp pine, earth, and something faintly metallic, an odor that made her stomach twist. Her pulse raced, hammering in her ears, but she forced herself to focus, each movement deliberate, careful, urgent. Louise finally spoke, voice low and tense. "I think we're actually getting away." But even as he said it, the unease lingered, a subtle, gnawing reminder that the night wasn't done with them yet. The forest, the lake, and the darkness itself seemed to stretch endlessly around them, a living entity that had been patient, and now only just acknowledged their attempt to escape. The tires crunched over gravel as they moved down the narrow path, the car lights cutting weakly through the dense shadows of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made their hearts jump. Jenna's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white, her pulse racing in rhythm with the tires over the uneven ground. Louise scanned the tree line nervously, whispering, "I don't see anything. Yet." But his words were hollow, unable to mask the tension in his voice. The night was still alive with unseen eyes, and though the flickering light had disappeared, the sense of being observed remained heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing against their shoulders. Mark glanced at the lake briefly, its surface now calm, deceptively serene, reflecting the dim glow of the early stars. But the calm felt wrong, too quiet, too perfect. Their instincts screamed that whatever had followed them, or watched them from the tree line, was still there, patient, deliberate, and waiting for a misstep. Jenna forced herself to focus on the road, each turn careful, calculated yet urgent. The forest pressed close on either side, the darkness thick and consuming. Even the faint chirping of insects or distant splash of the lake felt amplified, threatening, each sound a reminder that the night wasn't empty. The tension was almost unbearable. Every small shadow seemed to twitch unnaturally, and every gust of wind through the trees felt like a signal, a subtle warning. Louis shifted in his seat, voice trembling slightly. "Just a little further. We can make it." Mark nodded, eyes wide, gripping the edge of the dashboard. Jenna's pulse hammered in her ears, yet she forced the car forward, knowing that the only way out was straight ahead. The forest seemed endless as they drove, shadows stretching alongside the narrow path, twisting unnaturally in the weak glow of the headlights. Every step the tires took over gravel and dirt felt loud, almost like announcing their presence to something lurking just beyond the edge of the road. Jenna's hands were slick with sweat, her knuckles still white, every nerve in her body tense and alert. Luis leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the tree line. I think we lost it," he whispered, trying to sound hopeful, though his voice trembled. Mark stayed quiet, glancing repeatedly in the rearview mirror, expecting to see movement, expecting the flickering light to reappear. But for now there was nothing. Just the darkness, patient and silent, waiting. The air inside the car was thick, charged with adrenaline. The faint scent of wet pine and earth lingered, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that clung to them all. Jenna's heart thumped so loudly she could hear it echoing in the confined space of the car, each beat a reminder that they had narrowly escaped something they couldn't see, couldn't fully understand. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, rattling branches and leaves, sending a chorus of cracking sounds echoing across the clearing they had just left. The sound made them all jump, bodies tensing instinctively. Even though the car was moving, the forest felt alive, its presence pressing in around them like a living entity aware of their flight. Mark finally broke the silence, voice low and cautious. "We're not out of this yet. Just keep going." Jenna nodded, foot steady on the pedal, eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every subtle movement a potential threat. Yet with each passing second they were moving farther from the fire, the lake, and the tree line where the flickering light had haunted them. Escape was still uncertain, but hope, fragile and trembling, had returned. The narrow path twisted and turned, lined on both sides by dense forest. Shadows stretched and curled unnaturally in the headlights, moving with the slightest gust of wind. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made them flinch, hearts hammering in their chests. The night was no longer just dark. It felt alive, aware and patient, as if the forest itself was observing their flight. Jenna's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. Each breath came short and fast, every muscle tense. Luis's voice broke the heavy silence, barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. I think maybe we're actually making it out." But even he didn't sound convinced, the tremor in his tone betraying the lingering fear. Mark's eyes darted repeatedly into the rear-view mirror. The path behind them remained dark, empty, but the memory of the flickering light and the unseen presence behind the trees made every shadow seem threatening. The forest loomed close, the night heavy with anticipation, as though it had been holding its breath for hours, waiting to see if they could escape. The air inside the car was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Jenna forced herself to focus on the narrow road, each turn deliberate, each movement careful but urgent. Her pulse raced, adrenaline flooding her system, making her senses sharper, more alert, and yet, despite the fear, a flicker of hope persisted. With each passing moment, the clearing, the lake, and the shadows where the light had once flickered fell farther behind them. The night still pressed in, heavy and watchful, but the grip of panic began to loosen, replaced by the cautious realization that they might just make it out of the forest alive. Finally, the trees began to thin, the dense forest opening slightly as the path led toward the main road. The oppressive weight of the night seemed to lift just enough to give them a small sense of relief. The flickering light across the lake was gone, replaced by the gentle shimmer of stars overhead, and the rustling of leaves returned to normal mundane sounds of nature. Jenna exhaled deeply, gripping the wheel with trembling hands, her chest heaving. Luis leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, trying to calm the pounding rhythm of his heart. Mark's gaze swept across the thinning trees, still alert, still aware that the night wasn't entirely behind them, but the immediate danger had passed. The car tires crunched onto the main road, a steady rhythm that felt reassuring compared to the eerie silence of the forest path. The night air now carried no threat, only the cool scent of summer. The embers of fear that had clung to them all evening began to fade, replaced by the shaky, cautious relief that they had escaped whatever had haunted the lake. Jenna glanced in the rear-view mirror one last time. Darkness stretched endlessly behind them, but the forest had finally receded, leaving only the quiet reassurance of safety. The laughter, warmth, and carefree summer evening had returned in memory, but tinged forever with the knowledge of the unseen presence that had watched, patient and deliberate. And as they drove away, hearts still racing, they knew this night, their last night at the lake, would remain with them forever, a true reminder that sometimes the most ordinary summer nights can hide the most extraordinary fear. The car now moved steadily along the quiet country road, headlights cutting through the darkness, leaving the forest and the lake far behind. Jenna's hands were still tense on the wheel, her knuckles white, and every now and then she swallowed hard, the memory of the flickering light and the unseen presence pressing briefly against her mind. The adrenaline of escape had faded slightly, replaced by a lingering unease that refused to be shaken. Luis exhaled, letting his shoulders slump against the seat. "I can't believe that just happened," he murmured, voice low and trembling. Mark stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the road, though his jaw was tight. Each of them carried their own version of fear, their own weight of what they had seen or thought they had seen in the shadows. Jenna thought back to the fire, the flickering light across the lake, and the countless subtle warnings she had ignored until it was almost too late. The night had seemed ordinary at first, laughter, warmth, the gentle ripple of water. But it had transformed into something else entirely, something patient and deliberate, a presence that lingered in the edges of their vision and minds. The forest receded behind them, the familiar sights of summer homes and streetlights ahead, bringing a measure of comfort. But the memory of that night, the way the shadows seemed alive, the light that moved with intention, remained vivid. Every small detail, every sound, every flicker would replay in their minds for years to come, a reminder that even ordinary summer nights can hide extraordinary fear. And as they drove onward, the silence in the car was not peaceful. It was reflective, heavy with thought. The kind of silence that comes after a close encounter, the quiet understanding that some nights change you forever, leaving you looking over your shoulder long after the danger has passed. The quiet hum of the car engine filled the space, mingling with the occasional rustle of summer leaves outside. Jenna's mind kept replaying the events of the night, the flickering light, the unseen presence, the forest that had felt almost alive in its watchfulness. Every detail seemed sharper in memory now, etched into her mind with a clarity that made her stomach twist and her chest tighten. Luis broke the silence, voice soft, almost reverent. "Do you think it was real, or just our imagination?" His words hung in the air, unanswered, because deep down they all knew it had been more than imagination. The subtle cues, the deliberate pauses, the way the shadows had seemed to follow their every move, it had felt too intentional, too deliberate to be merely in their heads. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and tense. "Whatever it was, it waited, patient, watching. It let us leave, but I don't think it ever really left." The words settled heavily in the car, echoing in their minds, confirming the lingering unease that none of them could shake. Jenna exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at the darkened forest receding behind them. The calm of the road ahead felt almost surreal, a stark contrast to the tension of the night that had passed. Yet even in the light of their escape, a small part of her remained alert, waiting for the impossible to return, waiting for the flickering light or the shadow that moved with intent. And in that reflective silence, they all understood that some nights leave marks you can't see, moments you can't forget, and a fear that persists long after the immediate danger has passed. The last night at the lake wasn't just a memory. It was a lesson, a reminder that even in familiar places the unknown can be patient, deliberate, and closer than you think. The headlights of the car cut through the darkened road, illuminating glimpses of familiar signs, street markers, summer homes, and the occasional glow of distant windows. Yet the calm of the outside world felt fragile, almost unreal, compared to the charged tension of the lake and forest they had just left behind. Every shadow, every movement in their peripheral vision made Jenna's chest tighten, a lingering echo of the night's fear. Luis finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the night itself was alive." He paused, swallowing hard. "Like it knew us, and it knew what we were doing, even before we did." His words sent a shiver down Jenna's spine. It wasn't just the fear of the unseen presence, it was the sense of being measured, watched, and then released, as if the night had been testing them all along. Mark exhaled slowly, gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I keep thinking about that light, how deliberate it was, how patient. It didn't rush us, it waited, and that's what gets me the most. It knew exactly when to appear and exactly when to disappear." The words hung heavily in the car, echoing the unspoken realization that the night had been far more intelligent, far more aware than any of them could explain. Jenna's hands loosened slightly on the wheel, but the tension in her shoulders remained. The memory of the flickering light moving across the lake, pausing as if observing them, would stay with her forever. Even as they left the forest behind, the sense of being watched persisted, a silent reminder that some nights leave marks not just on memory, but on instinct itself. And in that quiet reflection, all three understood something profound. The ordinary can hide the extraordinary, the familiar can harbor the unknown, and the events of a single night can linger in the mind, teaching a lesson that doesn't fade with the rising sun. The car rolled steadily along the quiet road, the familiar sounds of summer night, crickets, the distant rustle of leaves, feeling almost too normal after the tense hours they had endured. Jenna's hands rested lightly on the wheel now, though the tension in her body had not fully released. Her mind replayed every detail: the flickering light, the deliberate pauses, the forest that had seemed alive and watchful. Luis leaned back, voice low. "I keep thinking, what if we had stayed longer? What if we hadn't noticed it?" His words hung heavy, a reminder of the thin line between safety and danger. The three of them shared a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. What had happened was rare, unnatural, and entirely unforgettable. Mark finally broke the reflective silence, voice calm but tense. "We were lucky," he said. "It waited. It didn't follow us all the way. But it knew we were here. And that's what I can't stop thinking about." The weight of his words settled over them, heavy with the acknowledgement of the night's deliberate presence. Jenna exhaled slowly, the car lights illuminating the edges of the road ahead. The forest and lake were far behind, yet the memory lingered vividly, each detail sharp and unnerving. The fear had ebbed slightly, replaced by reflection, a deep understanding of how close they had come, how patient and deliberate whatever had watched them truly was. And as the quiet road stretched onward, they all felt it, the subtle, lingering impression of a night that had changed them. A summer night that had started ordinary, full of laughter and warmth, had ended as a lesson, a reminder, and an indelible memory of the unknown watching just beyond the shadows. The road ahead gradually widened, and the distant glow of town lights began to pierce the night, a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest they had just left behind. Jenna's hands relaxed slightly on the wheel, though her pulse remained elevated, a subtle reminder of the lingering tension. The night's events had left an imprint on them, a silent knowledge that the ordinary could hide something extraordinary. Luis exhaled, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I don't think I'll ever see a lake at night the same way again," he admitted. The words hung between them, honest and heavy, carrying the weight of a shared experience that would remain with them forever. Mark nodded, eyes fixed on the road, but his mind clearly elsewhere. "We saw something, or felt something, something patient. Something that could wait hours, maybe days, without making a sound, just to see us react." He paused, the car moving steadily forward. "And that's the part that sticks with me, the knowing, the presence, not attacking, just waiting." Jenna glanced once more toward the rearview mirror, seeing only the darkness beyond the town's edge. The forest, the lake, the flickering light, they were behind them, yet the memory remained vivid. Every detail, every subtle sound and movement, every moment of fear and tension had etched itself into her memory. And as they drove into the soft glow of streetlights and the promise of safety, they carried more than just relief. They carried a lesson. That summer night, their last night at the lake, would forever remind them that even ordinary places, ordinary nights, and ordinary moments could conceal something deliberate, something patient, and something unforgettable. Jenna, Luis, and Mark had escaped the forest, their hearts still racing, minds still replaying every flicker of light and every shadow that had haunted them by the lake. The night had left its mark, a memory of fear that wouldn't fade quickly. But as the summer night drew on, the world didn't stop revealing its secrets. While one story had ended, the darkness had another tale to tell, one that would unfold in a place they thought safe, a place where endings are only temporary, and fear can find you in the most ordinary moments. So keep your headphones on, lights low, and senses sharp, because the next story is just beginning. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly as they drove the narrow dirt road, the sun dipping behind the horizon and casting the cornfields in long, crawling shadows. The air smelled sweet and earthy, a mixture of ripening corn and the faint scent of dust kicked up by the tires. Every rustle of stalks in the evening breeze seemed amplified, like a whisper brushing against the car windows. Tyler, sitting in the passenger seat, hummed nervously, pretending to be relaxed. "Looks bigger at night, doesn't it?" he said, trying to joke, but his voice wavered slightly. Emma didn't answer. She felt a tightening in her chest, a tension that wouldn't go away. The cornfields on either side seemed endless, the stalks swaying as if they were alive, moving in unison with the wind, or perhaps in time with something unseen. As they turned the final bend in the road, the cabin came into view. It was small, rustic, and weathered, its wood darkened by years of sun and storms. The porch creaked faintly in the breeze, and the windows reflected the last golden light of the sunset, but something about the stillness unsettled Emma. The clearing around it was overgrown, the driveway barely visible beneath tall grass, and the corn stalks pressed close, almost as if forming a wall around the cabin. Emma parked the car, exhaling slowly, though her hands still shook slightly. Tyler fumbled with the car doors, and as they stepped out, the wind carried a faint rustle of corn that seemed too deliberate. The shadows shifted across the ground, moving with an unnatural rhythm, and Emma's stomach tightened. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and growing crops, but beneath it lingered something faintly metallic, almost imperceptible. A warning, perhaps, or simply the first sign that the night had begun to watch them. Even as she locked the car and approached the cabin, Emma felt eyes on them, though she knew the place was empty. The wind whispered through the corn, the silence pressing close, and the night made its presence known, patient, deliberate, and waiting. The cabin door creaked loudly as Emma pushed it open, the sound echoing strangely in the stillness of the clearing. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint, musty scent of old wood and time long past. Dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through the windows, and every small sound, Tyler's footsteps, the groan of the floorboards, seemed amplified, unnervingly sharp in the quiet. Tyler shuffled behind her, nervously glancing toward the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. "It's cozy," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. His words felt hollow, a thin attempt to mask the tension that had settled over both of them. Emma didn't respond immediately. Instead, she scanned the cabin carefully, noting every shadow, every shift of the evening light as it crept across the walls. The windows looked out over the cornfield, the stalks swaying gently in the evening breeze. But even from inside the cabin, the movement felt deliberate, too purposeful to be random. Emma's chest tightened, a knot of unease forming as she realized how isolated they truly were. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road they had driven was narrow and easily lost in the dark. The cabin, it's a place of expected fun and relaxation, now felt like the center of a living, breathing tension that pressed in from all sides. Tyler dropped his bag on the floor with a soft thud, and Emma jumped at the sound. The wind picked up outside, rustling the corn in a way that made it sound almost like whispered voices. A shiver ran down her spine. She turned to Tyler, trying to force a smile, but even her attempt felt fragile, unconvincing. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the horizon, the cabin was fully embraced by darkness, and the cornfield became a wall of blackness, tall, dense, and silent. Emma realized that the night had begun its watch, patient and deliberate, waiting to see what would happen next. And for the first time that evening, she understood that this weekend in the cabin might not be just a quiet summer getaway. It could become a night that would test their courage, patience, and perception in ways they hadn't imagined. Emma walked to the small kitchen area, her footsteps soft against the creaking wooden floor. The cupboards were empty, except for a few dusty plates and mugs, and the faint scent of aged wood lingered. Every shadow in the corners of the room seemed to twitch as she moved, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself was aware of their presence. Tyler lingered near the doorway, glancing nervously at the windows. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly, voice tense. Emma paused, straining her ears. There was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the cornfield outside, a faint rustle, rhythmic and deliberate, unlike the casual wind. Her stomach tightened. The cornfield was watching, or at least it felt like it was. The light of the last sunset had disappeared completely, leaving the cabin in shadows that seemed to stretch longer than natural. Emma flicked on a small lamp, its weak glow illuminating the room, but it did little to chase away the darkness pressing at the edges of her vision. Every corner seemed deeper, every shadow heavier. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, and Emma noticed the way his hands trembled slightly. The playful anticipation of a weekend getaway had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Outside, the cornstalks swayed gently, but Emma swore she could feel them leaning slightly toward the cabin, as if listening, waiting. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the faint rustling louder, almost like a whisper. Emma's pulse quickened. She tried to calm herself, tried to reason it away as the ordinary sounds of an August night. But deep down, she knew the night had changed. The cabin, the cornfield, and the darkness around them were no longer just scenery. They were participants, patient, deliberate, and watching. Emma and Tyler unpacked their bags quietly, each movement deliberate as if the slightest sound could draw attention from the shadows outside. The cabin was small, with a low ceiling and wooden beams that creaked under every step. The air smelled faintly of earth and old wood, heavy with the warmth of the day that had passed. Tyler opened a window to let in some air, and the rustling of the cornfield outside filled the room. The sound was gentle at first, but with every passing moment it seemed to grow sharper, more intentional, like the stalks themselves were swaying in rhythm with their movements. Emma shivered, feeling a chill creep up her spine, even though the evening was still warm. The darkness outside deepened quickly. What had seemed like a quiet, welcoming space now felt isolated, enclosed by the towering corn that rose higher than the cabin roof. Every shadow cast by the lamp flickered against the walls, twisting with the movement of their bodies, creating shapes that seemed almost alive. Tyler moved toward the small living area, trying to distract himself. "Maybe we can start a fire later," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma glanced toward the fireplace, imagining the shadows dancing on the walls, and realized that even a fire might not fully chase away the oppressive feeling pressing in from outside. The night had settled in completely, carrying with it a stillness that was anything but peaceful. The cornfield loomed, patient and deliberate, and the cabin, once thought of as safe, now seemed like the center of an unseen watch. Emma felt it keenly, the awareness that something was out there, observing, waiting, and that the night had only just begun. Emma finally set down the last of their bags, and for a moment, the cabin was still. The wind outside whispered through the cornfield, carrying the subtle, almost musical rustle of leaves brushing against one another. But the sound wasn't soothing. It was deliberate, patient, like a presence making itself known without showing itself. Tyler hesitated near the doorway, peering out into the towering stalks. "It's really dark out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, feeling the tight knot of unease in her stomach. The cornfield seemed endless, dark, and almost suffocating in its stillness. Every stalk could be hiding something, every shadow could be watching. The cabin's interior felt smaller now, confined by the unknown stretching outside. Even the familiar wooden walls seemed to press inward, carrying echoes of their footsteps and the faint hum of the evening air. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of anticipation and fear that something was waiting for them just beyond the windows. A faint sound, a snap of a branch, almost imperceptible, made them both freeze. Emma strained to listen, heart hammering in her chest. The corn swayed softly in response to the breeze, yet there was something deliberate in the rhythm, something that didn't belong to the wind. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm, but the feeling remained. The night was patient, deliberate, and very aware of them. The cabin, the cornfield, and the darkness beyond had become participants in their story, and the weekend they had anticipated as peaceful and carefree had already begun to twist into something far more unsettling. Night had fully settled over the cabin, the cornfield outside now a wall of darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. Emma and Tyler had unpacked, eaten a quick dinner, and tried to relax, but the shadows cast by the weak cabin lights seemed deeper, heavier, and more deliberate than they had earlier imagined. The wind whispered through the stalks, producing a subtle, almost rhythmic rustle that made every hair on Emma's arms stand on end. It wasn't just the sound of corn moving in the breeze, it carried weight, presence, intention, like the field itself was alive and aware of their every move. Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to distract himself with his phone, but the faint glow illuminated only the cabin's interior. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of shadows against the walls, amplified the silence, turning it into something tense and watchful. Emma watched him nervously, wishing she could convince herself it was just imagination. Outside, a faint movement caught her eye, a shadow shifting between the stalks near the edge of the clearing. She blinked, thinking she must have imagined it, but the rustling continued, deliberate and synchronized, as if something unseen was pacing just beyond the cabin. Emma's heart began to race, each beat a drum in the quiet night. She could feel the tension thickening in the air, pressing down around them like a physical weight. Tyler sensed it too, glancing up from his phone with a hesitant frown. The ordinary sounds of a summer night had transformed into something deliberate, patient, and uncomfortably close. And in that moment, both of them realized that the night in the cornfield had only just begun to reveal its secrets. The cabin seemed smaller now, enclosed by darkness that pressed in from every window. Emma tried to distract herself, moving toward the small living area to check that everything was locked and secure. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, each sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet, making her jump slightly. Tyler followed her hesitantly, glancing toward the cornfield with wide, nervous eyes. "It feels wrong out there," he whispered, voice tight. Emma nodded, swallowing hard. The rustling of the corn outside had grown subtly louder, more deliberate, like the stalks themselves were shifting in anticipation. She flicked on a small lamp, the weak light doing little to chase the oppressive darkness from the corners of the cabin. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting as if moving with a life of their own. Emma felt her pulse quicken, her senses heightened, every nerve alert to the slightest sound. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the shadows dance wildly. Tyler flinched, clutching the edge of the table, and Emma exhaled shakily, trying to calm her rising fear. Yet even as she reassured herself, she could feel it, the presence outside, patient and deliberate, watching them from the darkness beyond the cornfield. For a moment, everything seemed still again, the rustling paused, the night holding its breath. Emma's chest tightened with anticipation, the silence becoming almost unbearable. They both knew, without speaking, that the first night in the cornfield cabin was already testing them, showing them that the ordinary could conceal something extraordinary, and the night had only just begun. Emma moved toward the small kitchen, her footsteps careful and quiet, trying to convince herself the noises outside were nothing more than wind and the natural rustle of corn. The weak lamplight barely reached the far corners of the cabin, leaving patches of shadow that seemed to twist and stretch with every movement she made. Tyler lingered near the doorway, peering into the darkened field. "I swear I saw something move," he murmured, voice trembling. Emma froze, her stomach tightening. She strained her ears, listening. A faint rustle came again from the cornfield, slower this time, deliberate, like something pacing just out of sight. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, charged with tension. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, every soft whisper of wind against the windows seemed amplified, turning ordinary sounds into signals of presence. Emma's pulse raced, each heartbeat echoing in her ears. The shadows on the walls seemed almost to lean toward them, shifting subtly with the wind outside. Tyler hugged himself, shivering slightly. "It's just waiting, isn't it?" he whispered. Emma nodded, unable to respond aloud. The thought was chilling but undeniable. Something in the cornfield was aware of them, patient, deliberate, observing every movement, every sound. A sudden snapping noise, sharp and distinct, came from the edge of the clearing. Both of them froze, hearts pounding, listening to the faint echo of the stalks swaying. The night was no longer quiet, it was watchful, deliberate, and undeniably alive. And in that instant, Emma realized that the first night in the cornfield cabin would test them in ways they hadn't yet imagined, pushing their courage and their perception to the limit. The night grew heavier, wrapping the cabin in a darkness that seemed almost tangible. Emma and Tyler tried to focus on small tasks, setting up sleeping bags, checking the windows, but each movement was accompanied by the subtle, deliberate rustling of the corn outside. It was as if the field itself was alive, shifting in time with their actions, patient and deliberate in its observation. Emma's hands shook slightly as she secured the last window latch. The weak lamplight cast long shadows across the walls, twisting in the corners, making familiar shapes appear alien and threatening. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind felt amplified, each sound a signal of the presence waiting just beyond the cabin. Tyler stayed close, peering occasionally through the blinds at the swaying corn. "It's watching us," he whispered, voice tight. Emma swallowed hard, heart racing, knowing he was right. There was an awareness out there, patient, deliberate, a consciousness she could feel pressing in from the darkness. A sudden gust of wind rattled the roof above, echoing like a warning. Emma flinched, gripping the edge of the table, and Tyler's eyes widened. The stillness that followed was even more unnerving, thick with anticipation, as though the night had paused to measure their reactions. Emma exhaled slowly, trying to calm herself, but the feeling remained. The night was patient, the cornfield deliberate, and their weekend getaway had shifted from ordinary relaxation to a test of perception and courage. They were not alone, and whatever waited in the darkness had just begun to make itself known. Emma and Tyler finally settled near the small fireplace, trying to make the cabin feel safer. The flames flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Yet even with the fire, the darkness beyond the windows felt alive, stretching tall and deliberate, as if the cornfield itself had eyes. The wind outside whispered through the stalks, producing a sound that was not quite natural, a faint, rhythmic rustling, deliberate in its pacing. Tyler shivered, pulling his knees close to his chest. "It's like it knows we're here," he murmured. Emma nodded silently, unable to dismiss the feeling. Every small sound within the cabin seemed amplified. The crackle of the fire, the settling of the old wood, the faint creak of the ceiling beams. The contrast between the safe interior and the deliberate awareness outside heightened their tension. It was a night full of ordinary sounds, made sinister by the patient observation of something unseen. Emma's eyes kept drifting to the windows. The shadows among the corn seemed to move just slightly, swaying with a rhythm that did not match the wind. Her stomach twisted with unease. This was no ordinary field, no ordinary night. Whatever watched them was patient, deliberate, and entirely aware of their presence. As the fire flickered and the wind whispered, Emma and Tyler understood something profoundly unsettling. The first night in the cornfield cabin was not simply a quiet summer evening. It was a night that had already begun to mark them, a patient reminder that ordinary places can harbor extraordinary and deliberate fear. The night deepened, and the cabin grew quieter, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Emma and Tyler had tried to rest, but the darkness outside seemed heavier than before. From somewhere deep within the cornfield came a faint, irregular rustling, soft at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but deliberate in its pattern, as if marking their presence. Tyler sat up, straining his ears. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Emma froze, listening carefully. There it was again, faint but distinct, a soft shuffling sound, moving rhythmically through the stalks. It didn't seem random, it had intention, as if something or someone was pacing just beyond their sight. Emma's chest tightened. Every nerve in her body was alert, the kind of heightened awareness that made ordinary sounds feel loaded with meaning. The creak of the cabin's floorboards beneath her movement, the faint groan of old wood, the whisper of wind through the windows, they all blended into a tense symphony of uncertainty. She glanced toward the windows. The shadows among the corn shifted, swaying slightly with the wind, but there was a deliberate quality to the motion that made her stomach twist. Tyler's face reflected the same unease. Even inside the small cabin, they were acutely aware of an unseen presence, patient, deliberate, and silently observing. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. But the sensation lingered. The cornfield was alive with movement, the darkness deliberate, and the first night's quiet had shifted into something altogether different, a slow, patient surveillance that seemed to measure their reactions, waiting to see what they would do next. The rustling from outside grew more noticeable, carrying a rhythm that didn't match the gentle breeze. Emma's pulse quickened. Every soft whisper of movement through the corn felt deliberate, like something was pacing just beyond the clearing, circling the cabin in a slow, watchful loop. Tyler hugged his knees closer to his chest, voice tight. It's moving around us," he whispered. Emma nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. The wind carried faint, almost musical sounds, soft taps and gentle snaps that seemed intentional, deliberate in timing. Nothing about this night felt random. The cornfield itself seemed alive, aware and unhurried in its observation. Emma moved closer to the window, peering through the dim light, but the thick stalks blocked any clear view. Shadows shifted unnaturally, swaying as if they had weight beyond the breeze. The darkness felt patient, deliberate, and knowing. Every instinct in her body screamed that they were being watched, and the night had become something more than ordinary. A silent presence, testing them in ways they hadn't imagined. Tyler swallowed hard. "Do you think it can see us?" he asked quietly. Emma's throat tightened. She didn't answer. The thought lingered, chilling, as another faint rustle sounded from the field. The night had stretched, patient and deliberate, marking the first hints of a fear that could grow with each passing hour. Emma exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the awareness persisted. The first night in the cornfield cabin had shifted. The quiet, the shadows, and the strange sounds had become deliberate participants in their story, waiting, watching, and testing their courage. Emma moved closer to the center of the cabin, trying to convince herself the sounds outside were nothing more than the wind. But the rustling persisted, purposeful and rhythmic, as though the cornfield was circling them in silent observation. Each snap and crackle made her flinch, heart hammering in her chest. Tyler whispered from the corner, voice barely audible, "It's waiting for us to notice." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. She could feel the tension pressing in from the windows, the shadows outside stretching taller, darker, more deliberate with every moment. The cornfield wasn't just moving, it was aware, patient, and calculating. The lamp flickered faintly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, twisting with the movement of their own bodies. Emma's eyes kept darting to the windows, scanning the blackness between the corn stalks, but every glance returned only the same heavy, impenetrable darkness. Yet she knew in the pit of her stomach that something was there, waiting, deliberate and silent. Tyler shifted uneasily, glancing toward the window and then back at Emma. "Do you think it's alive?" he whispered. Emma couldn't respond. The word felt inadequate to describe the sensation that pressed against them. An awareness, patient and deliberate, testing their reactions, measuring their fear, without ever revealing itself fully. A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin and carried the faintest rustle through the cornfield, like a soft footstep in the distance. Emma's pulse leapt. The night had grown patient, deliberate, and increasingly purposeful. The first night in the cornfield cabin was no longer ordinary. It was a slow, careful introduction to something unseen, something deliberate, and something that would not be ignored. The rustling outside shifted again, closer this time, subtle but deliberate. Emma's heart raced as she strained to listen, her pulse echoing in her ears. Every creak of the cabin, every faint groan of the old wood seemed magnified in the tense silence. The wind through the cornfield carried a rhythm that wasn't random. Snaps, soft shuffles, whispers of movement that seemed synchronized, patient, and purposeful. Tyler's face was pale, eyes wide. It's circling the cabin," he whispered. Emma nodded silently, tension knotting her stomach. They could feel it watching, waiting, deliberate in its patience. It didn't rush, didn't reveal itself fully. It simply observed, shifting through the stalks in the dark, testing their awareness, measuring their reactions. Emma moved closer to the window, peering through the dark cornfield. The stalks swayed gently, but there was a pattern to their motion, almost imperceptible, deliberate. Her chest tightened as instinct screamed at her. They were not alone. The night had grown heavier, more deliberate, and the field outside had become a slow, patient presence, deliberate in every rustle, every subtle shift. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, flickering light across the cabin walls, but even that light seemed insufficient to break through the deliberate shadows gathering in the corners of the room. Every sound, every movement carried weight now. The first night in the cornfield cabin had shifted completely. It was no longer about ordinary summer fun. It was about awareness, patience, and the unnerving realization that the darkness outside had begun to mark them, slowly, deliberately, and inescapably. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, the fire now a soft glow, barely illuminating the corners of the room. Yet the darkness outside remained alive, deliberate and patient. The cornfield rustled again, slow and rhythmic, each sound carrying intention, a reminder that the night was far from ordinary. Tyler hugged his knees closer, voice tense. "I don't like it. It's too deliberate. like it knows we're here." Emma nodded, stomach twisting. The wind had become secondary now. Every rustle, every snap, every whisper felt purposeful, as if the cornfield itself had taken on consciousness, watching, waiting, testing. Emma moved to the center of the cabin, trying to ground herself in the ordinary, the table, the lamp, the faint smell of old wood. But even these familiar items could not dispel the sense of being observed. The night pressed close, patient, deliberate, and silent in its evaluation of them. A faint sound, a soft scrape, almost like fingernails brushing against wood, came from the edge of the clearing outside. Both Emma and Tyler froze, hearts pounding, eyes wide. The shadows among the corn seemed to lean slightly toward the cabin, as if curious, deliberate, waiting for their next move. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm, but the truth was clear. The first night in the cornfield cabin had transformed from quiet anticipation to patient surveillance. The night was alive, the cornfield deliberate, and the darkness outside had begun to teach them a lesson about awareness, fear, and the quiet patience of the unknown. The night grew heavier, the cabin wrapped in a thick, almost tangible darkness. Emma and Tyler had tried to settle, but the persistent rustling of the cornfield outside had escalated subtly into something different, something rhythmic, deliberate, like careful footsteps pacing just beyond the clearing. Emma's pulse quickened as she pressed herself against the back of the chair, listening intently. Each faint thud from the field carried weight, deliberate and slow, as though something or someone was circling the cabin with patient intent. The ordinary rustle of stalks had become purposeful, a warning or perhaps an introduction. Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" he asked, eyes wide. Emma nodded, unable to answer aloud. The sound persisted, soft, steady, deliberate. Each footstep echoed faintly through the clearing, amplified by the stillness of the night. The cabin's wooden walls seemed to groan in response, as if reacting to the tension pressing in from outside. Emma's senses were heightened, every creak and whisper of the structure magnified, merging with the deliberate steps moving through the cornfield. She could feel their weight, the patience behind them, the sense of being observed, measured, and tested. A gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying the faint scrape of footsteps across the dirt and underbrush. Emma's stomach twisted. The night had transformed once again. What had started as whispers and rustles had become patient, deliberate, moving presence. The first night in the cornfield cabin was now an intimate dance with the unknown, slow, measured, and impossible to ignore. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, weaving through the darkness outside the cabin. Emma pressed herself closer to Tyler, her chest tight with tension. Each soft thud against the earth carried weight, as if the night itself were testing their awareness, measuring their reactions with patient intent. Tyler's eyes darted nervously toward the windows. "It's circling around us," he whispered. Emma's heart raced. She could almost imagine the shadows between the corn stalks bending, shifting, deliberate in their motion, as though the unseen watcher moved with purpose and patience. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scrape of movement from one side of the clearing to the other. It was subtle, but Emma noticed it immediately. There was rhythm, control, and intent. Ordinary summer sounds had been replaced by something uncanny, deliberate, and persistent. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the table, trying to ground herself. The cabin no longer felt like a safe retreat. The walls, the floors, even the flickering lamp seemed to amplify the presence outside. Every footstep, every rustle, every faint snap told them something they couldn't quite see but could unmistakably feel. They were being observed, circled, and measured by something patient, and deliberate. A final soft thud sounded close to the cabin, making Emma and Tyler freeze in tense silence. The night had become a slow, deliberate test, a reminder that even in isolation, the ordinary could conceal something extraordinary and watching. The first night in the cornfield cabin had reached a new level, one where fear was no longer optional. It was unavoidable. Emma's eyes darted toward the windows again, straining to see through the thick darkness of the cornfield. The shadows between the stalks seemed to shift with each subtle gust of wind, deliberate and measured, almost as if something unseen was pacing just beyond their sight. Tyler's breathing grew shallow. "It's closer this time," he whispered, voice tense. Emma felt her stomach tighten. The footsteps had a rhythm now, slow and unhurried, yet impossible to ignore. Each sound pressed against them through the walls of the cabin, deliberate, patient, testing their attention. The fire flickered, casting trembling light across the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, twisting with the low glow, echoing the movements outside. Emma's pulse quickened. Every nerve in her body screamed that the cornfield was no longer just a passive backdrop. It was a participant, deliberate and aware, observing each motion they made. Another soft thud sounded near the corner of the clearing, followed by a faint scrape against the earth. Emma and Tyler froze, hearts pounding. The sound was patient, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted them to notice without fully revealing itself. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. But the truth was undeniable. The first night in the cornfield cabin had transformed from eerie anticipation into deliberate observation. The footsteps outside were not random. They were patient, purposeful, and undeniably aware of them, and the night had only just begun to unfold its lessons. The night pressed closer, thick and heavy, as if the darkness itself had taken on weight. Emma and Tyler remained near the fireplace, eyes glued to the windows, listening intently. Outside, the footsteps had slowed, deliberate and patient, each step carefully measured, echoing faintly through the clearing. Tyler swallowed hard. It knows we're awake," he whispered, voice tight. Emma nodded, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The cornfield was no longer just a passive field. It had become a stage, every rustle, every snap, every footstep choreographed to test their awareness, to stretch their fear slowly, deliberately. The wind stirred again, carrying the subtle, almost musical scrape of movement. The shadows outside seemed to lean closer, swaying as if aware of their gaze. Emma's chest tightened, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Each sound carried intention, a patient, deliberate reminder that they were not alone. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a center point in the watchful darkness. The weak glow of the fire flickered across the walls, yet the shadows it cast seemed deeper, heavier, more purposeful. Emma realized that the night had grown deliberate in its patience. The first night in the cornfield cabin had reached a point where observation was as tangible as the air pressing in, a quiet but undeniable presence that refused to be ignored. The footsteps outside had slowed to a near whisper, but their presence was undeniable. Emma and Tyler sat in tense silence, listening to the patient, deliberate rhythm echoing through the cornfield. Each faint scrape and thud pressed against the cabin walls, a quiet but persistent reminder that they were being watched. Tyler's hands trembled slightly as he pulled his knees closer. "It's waiting for something," he whispered. Emma's stomach twisted with unease. She could feel it, patient, deliberate, aware. And the shadows outside seemed to sway in time with some invisible cadence. The fire flickered, throwing long, trembling shadows across the cabin walls. Emma's eyes remained fixed on the windows, scanning the impenetrable darkness of the cornfield. Every instinct screamed that they were being measured, each movement monitored, as if the night itself had grown conscious and deliberate in its observation. A sudden rustle, faint but closer than before, made them both flinch. Emma exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself it was just the wind, but deep down she knew better. The first night in the cornfield cabin had transformed completely. The ordinary anticipation had become a patient, deliberate test, the footsteps outside a reminder that the darkness had not only noticed them, it was studying them. Emma and Tyler exchanged a glance, silent but aware. The night was far from over, and the shadows outside had begun to mark them in ways that would linger long after the first morning light. The first light of dawn had yet to touch the cornfield, and the night's darkness lingered stubbornly, thick and heavy around the cabin. Emma and Tyler had barely slept, their nerves frayed from the patient, deliberate footsteps and the strange, rhythmic rustling of the stalks outside. But now, as a faint, grey light began to seep into the clearing, something new made itself known. A shadow. Emma spotted it first, a dark, shifting figure at the edge of the clearing, tall and indistinct. Her breath caught in her throat. It didn't move like a person, yet it moved with purpose, deliberate and measured, drifting through the corn in a way that felt unnatural. Tyler froze beside her, eyes wide, a whisper of disbelief escaping him. The shadow seemed to pause, just beyond the reach of the cabin's weak light, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Every instinct screamed at her. It was aware of them, patient, deliberate, and watching. The cornfield, once just a backdrop to their weekend getaway, had become a living presence, and this shadow was its silent emissary. Tyler's voice trembled. "Do you see that?" Emma nodded, unable to take her eyes off the dark figure. Even in the dim light it was unmistakable, deliberate in its presence, patient in its observation, and unnervingly calm. The air itself seemed heavier around it, carrying the weight of something deliberate, waiting and unyielding. Emma exhaled slowly, heart racing. The first night of eerie sounds and footsteps had given way to this new, undeniable presence. The shadow was deliberate, patient, and very much aware of them. And as it lingered just beyond the clearing, Emma realized that the cornfield had begun to teach them a lesson about fear, patience, and the quiet persistence of the unknown. Emma and Tyler remained frozen, eyes locked on the shadow at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move like a person, yet it shifted imperceptibly, deliberate in its presence. Every sway of the corn stalks around it seemed intentional, guiding it closer or perhaps testing their observation. Tyler's voice was barely audible. "It's like it knows we're watching," he whispered. Emma's stomach twisted with fear. The figure didn't reveal much. It remained vague, undefined, yet its awareness was unmistakable. The morning light was weak, but even through the grey haze, the shadow's deliberate patience was palpable, pressing against them like a quiet weight. The cabin felt smaller now, its walls pressing in as if they, too, were aware. The fire's embers flickered, casting trembling shadows that danced in rhythm with the unseen presence outside. Emma's senses sharpened with each subtle shift in the clearing. The scrape of a stalk, a soft shuffle, the air itself stirring in response to the shadow's deliberate patience. A soft gust of wind carried the faintest whisper through the corn, and Emma's heart jumped. The shadow seemed to pulse with the movement of the stalks, patient, deliberate, almost as if it were breathing with the field itself. Tyler's hands trembled as he held hers. They both knew, without speaking, that the first night's eerie sounds, the footsteps, and now this shadow were connected, deliberate, patient, and inescapably aware of them. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. But the shadow remained, deliberate in its stillness, patient in its observation, and undeniably present. The cornfield had transformed completely. Ordinary summer night now replaced with deliberate fear, patient awareness, and the unnerving presence of something unseen yet undeniable. The shadow shifted slightly, just enough to make Emma's chest tighten. It was deliberate, patient, moving through the cornfield in a way that felt calculated, as if it were aware of every heartbeat and every breath inside the cabin. The faint grey morning light did little to reduce its presence. If anything, it highlighted the unnatural stillness surrounding it. Tyler swallowed hard, voice barely audible. "Do you think it's waiting for something?" Emma didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the clearing, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, all equally terrifying. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary figure, no simple trick of the light or shadow. Its deliberate patience carried an unmistakable awareness, an unspoken intelligence observing them, measuring them. The wind whispered through the corn, carrying with it subtle rustles, faint scrapes, almost musical in their rhythm. The shadow seemed to pulse in sync with these sounds, deliberate, patient, and undeniably alive in its own way. Emma's hands shook slightly as she gripped Tyler's arm. The cabin, the clearing, the morning light, all of it seemed secondary now to the presence beyond the windows, deliberate and patient in its observation. A sudden snap of a branch made them both flinch. The shadow didn't move quickly, didn't retreat, didn't advance. It simply lingered, deliberate, watching, waiting. Emma realized with a chilling clarity that the cornfield, the footsteps, and now this shadow had orchestrated a slow, patient introduction to fear, marking the first day of their stay in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. The shadow remained at the edge of the clearing, patient and deliberate, refusing to give them any more than a vague outline. Emma's chest tightened with every subtle movement it made. It didn't rush, didn't retreat, it simply existed, waiting and observing, deliberate in its stillness, as though testing their attention and their courage. Tyler whispered, voice trembling, "It's like it knows how scared we are." Emma nodded silently. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unseen but undeniably aware. Each faint rustle of the cornfield, every subtle sway of the stalks, carried purpose, deliberate and slow, pressing against the cabin and them like a quiet, inescapable presence. The fire's embers flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the walls. Emma's eyes stayed fixed on the clearing, tracking the shadow's subtle shifts. Every movement, however slight, felt calculated, deliberate, a patient reminder that they were being watched, measured, and assessed. The wind carried another faint scrape through the cornfield, a sound that made Emma flinch. The shadow remained patient, deliberate, waiting for a reaction. She realized that the first day in the cornfield cabin had transformed completely. The ordinary summer morning had become a slow, deliberate encounter with something unseen, deliberate, and very much aware of their presence. Emma exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the feeling persisted. The shadow was patient, deliberate, and unrelenting in its observation. The cornfield had become alive in a way that ordinary perception couldn't contain, marking the beginning of a weekend that would linger long after it ended. The shadow lingered, patient and deliberate, refusing to move closer or retreat. It was as if it existed solely to observe, to measure their reactions, and to remind them of its awareness. Emma and Tyler remained frozen, hearts hammering, eyes wide, captivated by its deliberate presence at the edge of the clearing. Tyler whispered, voice barely audible, "It's waiting for something, or someone." Emma nodded, stomach tight with unease. Every movement of the cornstalks, every subtle shift in the shadow's outline, felt intentional. It wasn't just a figure, it was an awareness, patient, deliberate, and unnervingly intelligent. The air inside the cabin seemed thicker now, charged with tension. The embers of the fire flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls that seemed to mimic the movements outside. Emma's mind raced, trying to rationalize the presence, but the instinctive fear in her gut was undeniable. The shadow was deliberate, patient, and inescapably aware. Another subtle movement of the stalk sent a chill down her spine. The shadow remained, unwavering, deliberate, a patient reminder that the cornfield had grown alive in ways ordinary perception could not contain. Emma and Tyler exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging what they both knew. The first night and morning in the cabin had introduced them to something patient, deliberate, and unrelentingly watchful. As the morning light slowly crept into the clearing, the shadow finally faded into the cornfield, but its deliberate presence lingered in their minds. The cornfield had marked them, and the weekend would carry the memory of patient, deliberate fear far longer than they could imagine. By the second day, Emma and Tyler were on edge, their nerves frayed from the night's patient, deliberate observations. The cornfield, once merely tall stalks swaying in the wind, had transformed into a labyrinth of deliberate presence. Every rustle, every subtle shift seemed charged with intention, reminding them that the weekend was no longer ordinary. Tyler packed a small bag quietly, glancing nervously toward the windows. "I don't want to stay another night," he whispered. Emma nodded, tension coiling in her chest. The footsteps, the shadow, the patient observation, they had left their mark. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a stage for deliberate attention from the unseen. The air was thick with anticipation, deliberate in its heaviness. The cornfield swayed gently, but Emma could feel it, the same patient, deliberate presence that had circled them the night before, now waiting, watching, unhurried. Every instinct screamed to leave, to escape, to move fast, yet the sense of being observed slowed them, deliberate in its testing of their awareness and courage. Emma and Tyler exchanged a glance, silently agreeing. It was time to go. But even as they opened the cabin door, the weight of the cornfield pressed against them, patient, deliberate, as if acknowledging their departure. The stalks shifted subtly in the breeze, the shadows stretching long across the ground, and the quiet was deliberate, as though the field itself had something to say, something patient, slow, and unnervingly aware. They stepped into the clearing, every sense heightened, every movement deliberate in response to the awareness pressing in from the edges of the field. The escape had begun, but the memory of the patient, deliberate presence in the cornfield would linger far longer than the journey back to safety. Emma and Tyler moved cautiously through the clearing, every footstep deliberate, hearts racing. The cornfield pressed close around them, tall stalks swaying gently, but with a rhythm that felt deliberate, as if the field itself were aware of their every movement. The air seemed thicker, heavier, charged with a presence that had patiently observed them since the first night. Tyler glanced back, voice tense. "It's still there." "Watching," he whispered. Emma's stomach twisted. Even in the faint morning light, the shadows cast by the corn seemed deliberate. Deliberate in the way they shifted and bent, as though marking each step they took. The rustling of the stalks was subtle but purposeful, a slow reminder that the field had been patient, deliberate, and unrelentingly aware. Every nerve in Emma's body screamed caution. The cabin behind them, once a refuge, now felt like a landmark in a deliberate, silent maze. Each movement forward carried weight, each glance back confirmed the patient presence of something unseen. The cornfield had become more than a backdrop. It had become a living, deliberate participant in their escape. Tyler's hand gripped hers tightly as they moved through the thick stalks, the deliberate sounds of the field echoing softly around them. Emma's breath came in shallow, careful gasps, her eyes scanning the shifting shadows for any sign of the patient observer. It was there, deliberate, slow and patient, a constant reminder that the ordinary can hide something extraordinarily aware. The clearing stretched before them, seemingly endless, but Emma knew that the escape had begun. Step by step, deliberate and cautious, they moved forward, carrying with them the memory of a night and morning marked by patient, deliberate fear, and a shadow that would linger long after the cornfield had faded behind them. The path through the cornfield felt longer than it should have. Emma and Tyler moved slowly, deliberately, every step measured. The stalks whispered around them, swaying with an unnatural rhythm, patient and deliberate, as if the field itself were aware of their fear and hesitation. Tyler's voice was tight with tension. "It's like it knows the way we're going," he murmured. Emma swallowed hard. Every rustle, every faint crack of a stalk against another felt intentional, deliberate. The field had become a presence, patient in its observation, testing their reactions at every turn. Shadows stretched across the clearing, bending slightly in ways that seemed impossible, deliberate in their subtle distortions. Emma's pulse raced as she felt a chill brush across her arms, a reminder that the patient, deliberate awareness they had felt since the first night was still with them, silent but undeniably present. The farther they moved, the more Emma noticed the pattern in the sounds, the deliberate rhythm of movement through the stalks, the patient pauses, the subtle shifts in shadow. The cornfield wasn't just scenery, it was an observer, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly intelligent in its quiet presence. Tyler glanced back once more, eyes wide. "I think it's still there," he whispered. Emma didn't argue. The escape had begun, but the presence, patient and deliberate, remained. Every step carried them closer to safety, yet the memory of the cornfield's silent observation would linger far longer than the physical path they were traversing. The clearing seemed endless, but Emma and Tyler pressed on, moving cautiously. The cornfield closed in around them, stalks bending slightly as if acknowledging each step, deliberate in their swaying. Every rustle, every whisper of movement was patient, a reminder that the field had observed them from the very beginning. Tyler's breathing was shallow, his eyes scanning the shadows between the stalks. "I don't think it's gone," he whispered. Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the deliberate presence pressing in, patient and unyielding. The footsteps, the shadow, the eerie awareness, they had all left their mark, shaping every step of this escape. The weak morning light revealed more of the clearing, yet it did nothing to diminish the sense of observation. The field seemed deliberate in its stillness, patient in its waiting. Emma could feel the rhythm of the stalks around them, subtle and slow, deliberate in how it mirrored their careful movements. Every nerve in her body remained on high alert. The cabin, the clearing, and the cornfield were all part of a slow, deliberate design, testing their awareness and courage. Each step forward carried weight, a reminder that the patient observation of the night and morning was still with them, lingering, deliberate, and unforgettable. Finally, the edge of the cornfield appeared ahead, a faint break in the rows of stalks. Emma and Tyler exchanged a glance, silent acknowledgement passing between them. The escape was near, but the memory of the patient, deliberate presence in the cornfield would remain, haunting their senses long after they left the field behind. Emma and Tyler finally stepped beyond the edge of the cornfield, their steps quickening, but careful. The clearing behind them seemed ordinary now, yet every rustle of the stalks, every faint shadow, carried the memory of patient, deliberate observation. The field had watched them, measured them, and left an imprint of fear that lingered in the air. Tyler exhaled, relief mixing with tension. "We made it, I think," he said quietly. Emma nodded, though her stomach still twisted. The cornfield had marked them, and the lessons of patience, awareness, and deliberate fear would remain long after they reached safety. The morning air felt lighter outside the field, yet the memory of the shadow, the footsteps, the subtle rustling remained heavy in their minds. Each sound, once ordinary, now carried the weight of deliberate observation. They realized the escape wasn't just physical, it was mental, leaving them acutely aware of the ordinary hiding something extraordinary. Emma looked back one last time at the cornfield. The stalks swayed gently in the breeze, ordinary yet deliberate, patient in their quiet watchfulness. They had survived, but the presence, patient and deliberate, would linger in memory, a reminder that even ordinary places can harbor something quietly observing, testing, and waiting. With careful, deliberate steps, they moved away, carrying with them the unforgettable experience of fear, patience, and the unnerving awareness of the cornfield's silent, deliberate presence. As Emma and Tyler finally left the cornfield behind, the morning sun cutting through the last shadows, one thing was clear. Some places aren't just quiet, they're patient. Some nights aren't just dark, they're deliberate. And some presences remain with you long after you've stepped away. The cornfield may have faded from sight, but its memory lingers, a reminder that fear doesn't always roar. It can creep, observe, and wait patiently, testing your awareness and your courage. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet, isolated place, listen closely. Watch the shadows. And remember, some things are patient, deliberate, and always aware. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you survived the story, but the next one is waiting. And trust me, it's even closer to home. Before we move on, drop a comment and say where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing who's brave enough to stay until the very end. Keep your lights low, your headphones on, and get ready, because story 3 is coming next, and it's not for the faint of heart.